Earlier on, I had a conversation with the DA leader, John Steenhuisen. He was telling us about their expectations, what they want to hear when the president is addressing the nation at 7 this evening.
Look, I think that we are expecting some big changes to be announced. We really want to see concrete steps being announced this evening that are going to get people into work, going to help catch up the time that our schools have lost, to be able to create jobs. I think we've had 4 years of commissions, of task teams being formed. I think what South Africans are now looking for is action. How are you going to get me out of a wooden iron shack in an informal settlement into a home? How are you going to build a safe community for me? How are you going to make sure that my children are getting a decent quality education? And most importantly, how are you going to help me get a job? I think these are the things that matter to ordinary South Africans. And I hope that there's going to be a focus on the action steps that are required and how those are going to be implemented over the year. Hope is not a strategy. You need to have a very, very clear path about what you're going to do within this year. And sadly, what we've seen from SONA's past is that the further you move away from the SONA speech, the further you come away from delivery on any of those major things.
Talking about the year going forward, we've just seen recently interviews for the position of the Chief Justice, and the DA criticized some of the questions that were posed to the judges, and you intend bringing legislation in Parliament to amend the composition of the JSC.
Absolutely. I think it was an appalling display, and I think that nobody who was involved in that process can honestly walk away and be proud of it, and I think the outcome, unfortunately, is tainted by that process. The vitriolic personal attacks on members of the judiciary, unfounded allegations being made, it is thuggery of the worst order. And my real worry is that good legal minds, people are currently sitting on the bench, look at that process and say, I don't want to actually subject myself to that, and therefore I'm not going to make myself available for any of these key positions. And what you're going to end up then is people who are not the best and brightest sitting on the bench. And you're going to end up with people who are either willing to run the gauntlet of that process or make some sort of Faustian pact with elements in the JSC to try and get themselves appointed. I think we've got to overhaul the way in which we choose our justices. I think the JSC is too big. I think we need to temper the number of politicians on there, which currently outweigh the number of legal professionals on there, so that we can start to have a more dignified process that suits the elevation of key members of the judiciary into the higher offices in the judiciary.
John, you are not the majority in Parliament, and legislation, they surely will be voting on that. How are you going to do that?
Well, obviously you try and win over the support of other people, just as we were able to do in the NCOP recently on the gambling bill, which we were able to defeat because we were able to convince delegations from other provinces against the bill. So you've got to go and lobby it, but at the very least, it's got to start a conversation about how we amend this process. We cannot afford another disgusting display that we saw there. I think it was undignified, and I think it is, as I say, tainted the entire process. And I don't think any South African looking at that can say, wow, that was a really good process to select the Chief Justice.
Have you sat down as a party and decided maybe the wording of the bill? How would you like it, the JSC to be, yes, the members to be?
So Glenys Breitenbach has been drafting the private members bill, and it should be able to be introduced certainly within the coming 2 months as Parliament starts to move past the SONA debate and onto its work for the year. One of the things I said, the size of it, it's too big. You can't come up with a decision when it is so big, and the overweening influence of politicians there rather than people who are in the legal profession, people who are in the know about what is required for a judge to be able to interpret and apply the law in South Africa. The judiciary has been the last stop in many instances for many actions that have compromised the Constitution and the like, and they've been the backstop. My worry is that if we end up with a weakened judiciary, that constitutional backstop, whether it is the Nkandla judgment, whether it's various other judgments, Groot Boom and others that have been handed down, could become compromised, and then I think our democracy starts to move out of kilter.
One of the pieces of legislation that Parliament is forced to consider this year is the amendment to Electoral Act, because there's a deadline that has been set by the Constitutional Court. As the DA, do you think you will make that deadline, considering that it's February now? We're left with just a couple of months before that?
Well, given the track record of Parliament, I would say no. The last 3 years have been the worst in Parliament's history in terms of legislative output. Parliament only has 4 jobs in terms of the Constitution: electing the President, passing legislation, executive oversight, and a forum for public debate. And I think we failed on 3 of those 4 jobs. Passing legislation is one of those things. And I think what you're going to see again is Parliament having to go back to the Concourt and asking for an extension. It's highly unlikely you're going to get a bill as complex as that and with as many implications as it has done in that short time frame.
What's the reason of starting it? Why was the reason to starting it this time? I mean, closer to the deadline than starting it early, because the Concord judgment was a little bit earlier.
Yeah, well, we've had instances in Parliament in the past where we've waited 3 years from the Concourt and then waited a month before the deadline and to go cap in hand to ask them for an extension of time. I think that there's a lot of issues that need to be grappled with in that bill, and I think that Parliament's been kicking the can down the road on it. I don't think there's been enough engagement on it, and it's reflected in the way in which we've dealt with legislation in the last 3 to 5 years.
Okay. John, we don't normally get these opportunities, and once we do, we must ask these questions.
Sure, of course.
As the DA, are you concerned that some of the senior former party leaders are joining Action SA? If I can talk about the former Nelson Mandela Bay Metro, who was once a member of Parliament, Athol Trollip. Is that a worry for the DA?
No, it's not a worry for me. Mr. Trollip left our party in 2019. He's been retired from politics since then. He's an ordinary citizen and he's free to join any political party that he wants. My party is not a personality-based party. It's a party of values and principles, and it's those values and principles that have guided our organization in the past and will guide us in the future. And so people will come and go in politics. You've seen recently there's some celebrities that have left the ANC to join the EFF. People make political decisions, and in a democracy people are free to choose, and I wish both him and anybody else all the very, very best for the future. I have nothing negative to say. They've made their own choices and they must go out and live those choices.
As political party leaders in Parliament, have you met after this incident of the fire? Have you met and map up the way forward as to how the business is going to be conducted?
Yeah. Well, there was an initial meeting with party leaders and the Speaker, but that work and mechanics has largely been done by the chief whips in Parliament. I'm very concerned, however, and I've raised these issues publicly and I will continue to raise them, that Parliament is going to be further defenestrated by the lack of a building now and lack of a place. And my worry is that Parliament has already been failing. And I think that if you look at the Zondo Commission report, for instance, Parliament was as much in the dock as anybody there. Why do we need a Zondo Commission to do the work that Parliament should have been doing? Why do we need a Mufamadi Commission to do the work that Parliament should have been doing? Why do we need Mr. Motlante's high-level panel report to do the work that Parliament should be doing? And so I think Parliament's going to have to use this time this year to really reflect on what its role is in South Africa. Are we living up to our constitutional obligations, and are we doing right by the people of South Africa? And I think one of the things that has to change is Parliament's going to have to come back to work full strength. This business of being on Zoom meetings and the like, it may work in a corporate world, it doesn't work in politics. And I'm very worried that MPs may appear logged in on the system but are busy doing other things. And the question we're going to ask, are South Africa's citizens getting their best value for money out of MPs who they can't see doing their work? We've got to get back to meeting in plenary, passing legislation, holding the executive accountable, and transforming Parliament, now that we have this opportunity, back into the bastion of executive accountability that it should be.
Thanks, John, for your time. Let's leave it at that. With that, Nzinga, John saying that Parliament must go back. They must stop working virtually so that they can continue with their business of doing legislation, of passing legislation, of holding the executive accountable.